This is Dan Schneider. This is another American TV with Mitchell Hadley. We've gone through the decades, we've gone through major trends, we've gone through major personalities. Now we're back to doing another decade. We are in the 1970s. And Mitch, before we begin, can you give a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure, and it's good to be back on again, Dan. Thanks. I'm a classic TV historian. I write about classic television and its relationship with American pop culture and history at itsabouttv.com, and I'm also the author of three books, including The Electronic Mirror, which looks at television and culture throughout the latter half of the 20th century. My upcoming book is The Descent into Hell, which will look at how classic television prophesized the times that we live in today. So it's an interesting topic, interesting way of looking at things.
So let's pick up where we did several shows ago with the end of the 60s in through the 1970s. Um, The dominant news story, of course, was Vietnam. After Martin Luther King had been assassinated, the civil rights movement sort of, I guess, took a little bit of a backseat. Feminism, or women's lib at that time it was called, came and went. But President Richard Nixon, Watergate, really took over as the major news stories. Yes, we had a little bit left of the space race, but after the moon landing, that sort of became old hat very
Mhm.
quickly. Um, where was television news in the early 1970s beyond Nixon and Watergate, which would happen in 72?
Well, one of the things that I find remarkable about television news in the 70s, there is a commercial for the ABC Evening News with Howard K. Smith and Harry Reasoner that comes from the very early 70s. And if you watch this commercial, they rapidly go through all of the issues that are affecting the world today and how ABC will be covering them. And with just a few editorial changes, almost all of these issues that were being covered in 1970 are being covered today. Instead of Vietnamization, you're talking about the Middle East. Instead of ecology, you're talking about the environmental movement. Instead of women's lib, you're talking about, broadly speaking, equal rights. It's gone beyond women's lib into all sorts of other things. But with just these few edits, almost everything else is the same. The Middle East is still a problem. The relationship with the government and the president is a problem. The inflation is a problem. Unemployment is a problem. Everything is the same as it was back then. So I think it goes to show in so many respects that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But you're right. The dominant theme as we enter the decade of the 70s remains the Vietnam War. And it may not be at the level of passion and frenzy that we saw in 68, 69. We now have a Republican president. We have apparently a commitment to trying to wind down the war, an acknowledgement that this is not going to be the total victory that we may have been talking about in the mid 60s. But it remains the preeminent story. You continue to see updates every night on casualty figures. You continue to see protests. You see young men fleeing to Canada to avoid the draft, and you're seeing all of this playing out on TV. But you're also seeing some other things as well. I think you're seeing the I don't want to say the maturation of television news because it has a long way to go. But by 1970, all three of the networks are now committed to 30-minute news broadcasts for the evening news. ABC was the last to do it, and they did it in 1967. So by 1970, we see the familiar evening news standard that we have today. We have the preeminent newscasters. You have Cronkite on CBS. You have NBC, which will be transitioning from Chet Huntley and David Brinkley into the John Chancellor era of the NBC nightly news, and he will have Brinkley off and on as one of his co-anchors, but it becomes Chancellor with the evening news. And this is where we really see Cronkite take over as the preeminent news broadcaster in the nation. Prior to that, Huntley Brinkley had been in control of the ratings. As the space program became more dominant in the news, and Huntley and Brinkley, neither one of them were vested in the space program the way Cronkite was. So you see CBS beginning to close in on NBC. You have a peculiar situation when there is a strike, the AFTRA strike in the late 60s, where Huntley does not honor the picket line because he considers himself a news reporter. Brinkley does honor the picket line because these are his fellow people. That doesn't drive a wedge between the two of them, but it does to a certain extent affect the impression that viewers have of them as a team. So, as we enter the 70s, Cronkite is the man. ABC is starting to put together for the first time a truly credible news organization. They've gotten Howard K. Smith from CBS. They've gotten Harry Reasoner from CBS. They have Frank Reynolds, who has established himself as being on President Nixon's enemies list, but he's a very visible broadcaster on the network. So ABC has put together a good news organization. And as the 70s unfold, and as Watergate begins to wind, or as the war begins to wind down, Watergate begins to wind up. That begins really in 1972 during the presidential race, although you don't hear very much about it at the time. It's really after the inauguration, when we get into 1973, that Watergate begins to become a major news story. And of course, by August of 74, we've had a change in administration. President Nixon resigns. President Ford is the new president. There is an adversarial relationship between the news media and the White House that has been established during the Nixon time in office that Ford is trying to damp down, perhaps. But it is a time when the news media becomes identified, for better or worse, with an anti-establishment viewpoint. But by that, I don't just mean partisan politics, but what I really mean is that in the documentaries, in the news reporting, in the very attitude that the media has, they're trying to go behind the scenes to expose the kinds of things that people may have taken for granted. So when we learn about the problems with Vietnam, when we learn about the problems with Watergate, we also start to hear other pieces of hidden things come out. We learn about the assassination attempts on Castro. We learn about other secret things being taken on by the CIA and the FBI. We have the Pentagon Papers. We have all sorts of different things that are starting to come out that is casting the media as kind of the truth seekers, trying to shine a light on what's going on. And I think that while the 70s may have been the golden era for that kind of news reporting and that kind of self-image, that really set a standard that they've tried to live up to since then. I think the media still likes to think of itself as digging for the truth rather than just reporting the conventional line. But this will be a topic for another day when we move into decades to go. But I don't think that it is quite the same as it was in the 70s, where there seemed to be a real investment in trying to dig out this kind of information.
Well, we had spoken earlier in another show about the rise of 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes was sort of I wouldn't say gonzo journalism, but it was at one point Mike Wallace, the lead reporter for 60 Minutes, was the most feared man in America to corporations. If someone got a phone call, the old legend went and it said it's Mike Wallace on the phone. CEOs would get into a panic.
Oh yeah, you had panic coordinators whose job specifically was to deal with how to help the CEO get through an interview with someone like Mike Wallace, if not Mike Wallace himself. So you're right, this whole gotcha type of thing that they show up on your doorstep becomes a real trademark of journalism, not just 60 Minutes, although I think they were the best at it, but of the media in general. And by the way, just want to mention quickly about 60 Minutes. People forget that was not a weekly show when it first aired. It was a monthly show. There would be occasional specials. It was on Tuesday nights. It was on at other times of the week. It'll be in the 70s that it really becomes established as an hour-long weekly show, mostly on Sunday nights until exclusively on Sunday nights, and it's where the 60 Minutes that we know today comes from.
Sticking before we head into sort of the fiction versions of shows on television, you can't speak of the 1970s without speaking of Monday Night Football, which was sort of a revolutionary approach to sportscasting. ABC had the wide world of sports. It had done Olympic coverage. There had been Olympic coverages by other networks in the earlier decades. But the National Football League in the 1960s was lagging behind Major League Baseball, which was then the number one sport. But with the merge of the American Football League, which was an upstart, in the older National Football League in the late 60s, and then the I guess crowning or the merge of those two gave rise to what became the Super Bowl. Football was really exploding, and it was driven really basically by one person, and that's Howard Cosell, who himself was an interesting, if not troubling, figure. If you have to talk a little bit about Monday Night Football and Cosell specifically, because not only with Monday Night Football, but he was doing, there was still boxing, heavyweight championship matches in that era, with Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton, those likes.
Yeah, ABC had a number of outstanding sports personalities, and one of the things you see in the 70s is that ABC clearly becomes recognized as the leader in sports coverage with the Olympics. With things like Monday Night Football. But the interesting thing about Monday Night Football is that prior to that, professional sports, or actually any kind of sports in prime time during the week, was very unusual. That was seen as a loss for the network. They were losing advertising revenue. They were losing ratings because people expected to see their favorite shows. And when the NFL began shopping around this idea of a primetime Monday night package, they gave first dibs to CBS because CBS had a long relationship prior to the merger with the NFL. And CBS turned them down. They had done some experimental Monday night games over the past 2 or 3 seasons, one a year maybe, but they were very hesitant. They didn't want to preempt, for example, the Doris Day show, which was a big show for them in their Monday night lineup. And so CBS passed on it. And the choice came down to either ABC or a syndicated package run by Howard Hughes's Hughes Sports Network. And the NFL wound up going with ABC. And I think, as you've suggested, the rest is history. What ABC did brilliantly, whether you like it or not, it was brilliant, was that they turned the concept of football into an entertainment spectacle. It was as if the Super Bowl were being played every Monday night. And by that I mean the network focused everything on this game each week. They had more cameras. They had more angles. They were able to promote the game throughout the week on their other programs. And they had these larger than life personalities. Don Meredith, who had come from the Dallas Cowboys to be a color commentator. They had Frank Gifford, who from the second year on took over as play-by-play. But as you suggest, the big name was Howard Cosell. And what Cosell did was to set himself up as the pantomime villain of network television. People loved to hate him. And they began having contests where people would throw bricks through their television sets for Monday Night Football. They had campaigns. CBS still had the radio rights to Monday Night Football, and they had a campaign to turn down the sound on TV and listen to what's really going on with the game with the announcers on the radio. And they even began to tailor their coverage on the radio to allude to the instant replays that people were seeing if they were watching the game on TV. But the fact is that Monday Night Football became a phenomenon. And Cosell became a phenomenon. He became the face of ABC. As you mentioned, he was not only doing football, but he had risen with Muhammad Ali in boxing. He had stood by Ali all through the time when he was Cassius Clay, when he had the problems with the government. He was stripped of the heavyweight title because of his refusal to military service in Vietnam. And Cosell had stuck with him when a lot of people had turned against him. So just as Howard helped build up Ali, Ali helped build up Howard. And Howard became almost a phenomenon of his own, that Monday Night Football, the game itself, was almost incidental to what was going on in the broadcast booth. And the stories about Cosell abound. If you're fortunate enough, for instance, to see a game early in the Monday night run in Philadelphia between the New York Giants and the Eagles, there's a story that Cosell came to the game intoxicated. And at one point in the first half, he throws up all over Don Meredith's cowboy boots. And his commentary is sparse throughout the first half and somewhat incoherent. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it's not the Howard that we've all come to know and hate. And in the second half, he disappears completely. He takes a cab back or a limo back from Philadelphia to New York, and they say Howard was under the weather. But those kinds of stories abound. People begin hanging up signs in the stadium that are not about their teams. They're about the Monday Night Football crew. Frank, Dandy Don, and the Mouth. And so between Monday Night Football and boxing, what we will see in the decade is that Cosell tries to parlay this into something beyond just sports. And I'll mention it here, although there's perhaps another place where we could talk about it. But Saturday Night Live is one of the shows that begins in the 70s on NBC. But people may remember that when it first came on the air, it was called NBC's Saturday Night. That's all. That was the name of the show. It was because there was another show on TV that had the name Saturday Night Live. It was Howard Cosell and his variety show, where he was beginning to think that if Ed Sullivan could do it and if Walter Winchell could try to do it, the next step logically should be that Cosell should host his own live variety entertainment show every Saturday night on ABC. Well, it was a failure. It was a huge failure. Not the only failure that ABC's had through the years, but it was a failure. But that was where the name Saturday Night Live was. And once the show went off the air, NBC was able to appropriate that, and it became Saturday Night Live because it was live. But so was Cosell's show, and Cosell was there first. So that's how Cosell's star rose. And eventually it will fall because he will begin to attack ABC as being complicit in what he sees as the sins of professional sports, the violence in boxing, the behavior of athletes when they're not on the playing field, some of the antisocial things that they were doing that were beginning to be covered. Cosell was part of that in treating sports as hard news and not just sports. And he would turn on ABC saying that they were complicit in this, that they were helping to promote it, that they weren't standing behind him. And the two entities divorce at some point along the way. But the Monday Night Football remains. The idea that sports can be a big entertainment spectacle on weekday nights in prime time, that continues to this day. And so we see one of the major changes in television that continues to this day.
Well, I think Cosell's a good example of overexposure. Aside from what you mentioned about the original Saturday Night Live, and I think we discussed that on another show briefly. Two other things come to mind. One was his participation in the Woody Allen movie Bananas, where he was narrating a supposed assassination in a banana republic. And a lot of people found that in quite bad taste, especially because Cosell was Jewish, and especially because I'm not sure if it came out not long after the '72 Olympics, which
Olympics,
and then the other thing that really I think went against his claims of credibility as a hard newsman was his hosting the Battle of the Network TV network stars, which ran from 77 to 81 or 82,
and again, it was a great rating success. But you're right. It in terms of sports, it's entertainment. And even though now Howard also had his own Sunday afternoon show where he would try to take on hard issues, and so you're right. He was on Sundays, he was on Mondays, he was on specials, he was in the movies. He introduced Frank Sinatra at Sinatra's main event concert in Madison Square Garden. He was everywhere, and that can go a long way when you are a pleasing avuncular personality. It goes a long way when you're seen as obnoxious, abrasive, aloof, and not really as smart as you think you are.
And I think another thing about Cosell was, despite his claims of wanting to be a hard journalist, the fact is that he was an enabler of Muhammad Ali in two aspects. Number one, Ali in the 1970s was not the fighter he was in the 60s, and he took to belittling a lot of his opponents. There was an infamous episode where Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali were on the air, and Muhammad Ali was calling Joe Frazier a gorilla. Now, he was a darker-skinned black man than Ali, and
then provoked him into a fight on the air.
And not only that, but with Ali's later association with Don King, some of his mafia ties came into question, and this was something that Cosell never broached because he was personally friends with Ali. I know this because I loved boxing back in the '70s. So did my dad. We used to watch it all the time, and we never particularly liked Muhammad Ali, not because of any of the Vietnam stuff or his being a black Muslim, but because of his involvement with people who were deep into organized crime. And this was something that Cosell never tackled or brought up with Ali.
You're right. You could argue that without Cosell, there is no Don King. Don King even had a weekly boxing show that he promoted every week on ABC that Cosell called the blow-by-blow for. So King became almost a partner with ABC and projects like that. And I think you're absolutely right that at the very least we're talking about a conflict of interest, and that we're talking about, it reminds me of the show we did about Barbara Walters last month. To see Barbara Walters and Howard Cosell co-hosting a show would have been something.
So one of the major themes of this show so far, and also as we continue, is ABC's rise from an afterthought network but behind CBS, the Tiffany Network, and NBC, the more serious older brother network of ABC. We'll get to some other aspects of it, but before we do, I do want to speak about carrying over from the 60s. We saw, when we spoke of the 60s, how we had shows like Room 222 and the Mod Squad and hipper, younger shows, more urban shows.
Hmm.
And this led to, in the early 70s, what was called the Rural Purge, which I guess CBS was the network most affected by.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk a little bit about the background of that, the Rural Purge, its effect on CBS, and since we're talking about ABC too, did this somehow give an opening for ABC to rise past the two older networks?
Well, the rural purge started with this idea of increasing demographics, the use of demographics when you're looking at your audience and how advertisers are going to appeal to those demographics. Now, by the early 70s, you have a change in the population of the United States. It's becoming less of a rural country, more of an urban country. And while they have some very highly rated shows, the Beverly Hillbillies is probably the best known of the Rural Purge shows, so we'll use that as our example. Even though the Beverly Hillbillies remained extremely popular, there was no real reason to believe that it was beginning to fade, but it wasn't attracting the right kind of viewer for the network. And you mentioned the Tiffany network. There's a saying that by the early 70s, CBS had started to be perceived as, the country broadcasting system, because you had the Beverly Hillbillies, you had Green Acres, you had Petticoat Junction, you had Hee Haw, you had the Andy Griffith Show, Lassie was still going on. So you had these shows that all appealed to a family demographic, a rural demographic, an older demographic. And Jim Aubrey, who was the head of programming at CBS, was particularly looking at trying to get away from this programming. Aubrey was involved. Michael Dan, who was one of their programming VPs, who particularly disliked the rural shows. He had kept them on because he knew that the ratings were still high, despite his personal animus toward him. But when Dan was replaced by Aubrey, then I think you started to see that change. Dan gets forced out. Robert Wood becomes the new president, a new president at CBS, and he's pressuring Dan to get rid of these rural programmings. They're not attracting the right audiences. They're afraid of the lucrative youth demographic. You could almost copyright or trademark that phrase, the lucrative youth demographic. That is where the money is, that is where the profits are. And for the first time, we see this philosophy that it isn't important how many people watch your show, it's what kind of people watch your show. And so if you have a very high rating in the 18 to 35 demographic, it doesn't matter if it's not the highest rated show of the night or the highest rated show of the week. It's getting the ratings from the audience that the advertisers are seeking, because they are supposedly the people with the disposable income, the people who are going to be spending money, and the people that you want to attract through advertising. So the Rural Purge had sort of had a soft rollout in the late 60s. They'd gotten rid of Password, What's My Line, I've Got a Secret, To Tell the Truth, all these game shows that appealed to these kinds of audiences. And then when it moved into the 70s, you saw these hit shows go away, all canceled. Caused some, I think it caused a bit of a rift with viewers, and it did, I think, open the door to ABC to give them an opportunity to make something happen. Now, ABC had as their programming whiz Fred Silverman, who had come from CBS, and so when Silverman comes to ABC, it's on the heels of having done some extremely creative programming at CBS. He had replaced these rural shows with these smart, urban, sharp comedies, All in the Family, Maude, The Jeffersons. Um, they're shows that are appealing to the young urban people, like the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which shows this unmarried, really in control of her life, isn't dependent on people. It's that girl, but maybe a step up because of Mary Tyler Moore herself, because she doesn't have the boyfriend that you see in that girl. So you see Silverman applying these lessons at CBS. When he goes over to ABC, he does something similar, but he does it with a different kind of shows. He goes with shows like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, which are both nostalgia based, looking back at the 50s. He goes with shows like Charlie's Angels, which is ostensibly a mystery, but what it really is an opportunity to show off the physiques of the stars on the show
Well,
to
it
great
was called
effect.
TNA TV was the thing.
Yes. And I think most our viewers will know what the T and the A stood for. And it's very. Now, that's not a knock on Charlie's Angels, and it's certainly not a knock on any of the actresses who were in it. Silverman's instincts were on the beam there that Charlie's Angels became a huge hit. He looked at shows like The Love Boat and Fantasy Island, which are concept shows, but I would say that in a way they're almost throwbacks to the old days of anthologies. And here's what I mean by that: you have a regular cast on The Love Boat and Fantasy Island, but they're not the focal points of most episodes. Instead, you have this star-studded guest cast that comes in, a combination of former big names and current B-listers and people who are on their way toward being big stars. So it's a very audience-friendly type of show. It blends romance and fantasy and comedy. They're easy to watch, fun to watch. They get huge audiences as well. So Silverman is banking on these kinds of shows to bring ABC out of the basement, and it works wonderfully.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking, ABC became identified with Gary Marshall, who The Odd Couple was his first foray into directing or producing a sitcom. And for my money, I think it's easily one of the top 5 American sitcoms of all time. I think it's number 1 because I think Klugman and Randall were the best TV comedy pairing ever. But Marshall then went on, as I said, with Happy Days, which was a spin-off from an episode of Love American Style. Which then spun off Laverne and Shirley, spun off Mork and Mindy, spun off Joni Loves Chachi, and maybe a couple of Blansky's Beauties or something like that. But I think one of the things that is often overlooked is that the 1970s, really from the end of Star Trek, from the late 60s through the late 70s until we got like Buck Rogers and a couple of midsummer replacements, sci-fi was almost dead on network television, with one major exception, and that was Lee Majors on ABC in The $6 Million Man, which ran for 5 seasons, had a couple of introductory movies, then in the 80s and 90s had some later movies, but it was easily the best and most popular sci-fi show of the era, and everyone my age or your age knows that sound, and then you see him doing everything in slow motion, even though he's supposed to be 3 or 4 times faster than the average human.
Widely parodied, but it could be parodied because everybody recognized it. And of course, it had a spin-off of its own, The Bionic Woman. But these
which was on a different network, NBC.
Yes, exactly. even though it shared much of the same cast.
Yeah.
But you're right. The $6 Million Man, which I suppose, if you wanted to stretch a point, you could include that in the idea of the fantasy type shows. Although, like you, I tend to think of it as science fiction. It's a high concept show in any case.
Yeah.
But that's part of ABC's big success. And you're right about Gary Marshall too. He was a real hit maker for a while there. I would say that The Odd Couple, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and the Bob Newhart Show were three of the smartest comedies that have been on television, and they were all on in this same time frame. And in fact, Newhart and MTM were on the same night.
Yeah.
So that was something that was really a change from the shows like Ozzie and Harriet or the Donna Reed Show. I don't want to say that they were better or worse, because many people like all of them equally, but they were a different kind of sitcom. They were portraying people in different situations. As I say, Mary Tyler Moore was a single woman. Bob and Emily on the Bob Newhart Show were a couple without children. You had different things going on.
Yeah, and MTM Enterprises was, along with the aforementioned Marshall, and we'll get to Norman Lear. Those were like the three titans of hit makers, because you had MTM had Mary Tyler Moore Show, Bob Newhart Show, Phyllis, Rhoda. Then I think the only dramatic spin-off from a comedy ever in Lou Grant.
Yeah.
And there might have been one or two other minor ones that just lasted a few episodes, but. Let's talk that. I think we will eventually do a Mary Tyler Moore focused show. But just in brief, Mary Tyler Moore, coming off the Dick Van Dyke Show, she marries, was it Grant Tinker was his name, who was an executive at CBS? Or was it? She marries him, forms MTM. It has the little kittens meow instead of the MGM Lions roar, and. Like I said, I mean, just these phenomenal shows. Two of them, Newhart and MTM, I would put again in top 10, top 12 sitcoms of all time. If you want to just talk a little bit about that combination that led to that company.
Yeah, I think that the trademark of those two shows specifically were that they had very appealing stars, and they had an extraordinary supporting cast. When people talk about MTM, invariably you're not only talking about Mary, but you're talking about Lou and Murray and Ted and Rhoda and Phyllis, and you have Mary's family at work, and you have Mary's family at home. And the only thing you're missing is the one thing it would have been unthinkable to leave out of a sitcom up until then, which would be Mary's biological family, because she doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have children. She would like to get married, like to be in a relationship, but I think she makes it pretty clear that she doesn't need to have a man in her life to have a happy and successful life. And that's a very radical change from what we've seen before. But because she has such a winning character, not only her character, but Mary herself personally, that is not seen as one of the message shows like some of the other sitcoms that we may get into. And it's with Bob Newhart, you've got Bob and Suzanne Plachette, who have this incredible chemistry, and then you have all of their friends, both again around Bob's job, because you see his workplace, but also the people that come to visit them. Howard, the airline pilot, and it's a wonderful supporting cast, and I think that those are just well, it's the same thing with the Odd Couple. I mean, the Odd Couple is great anyway, but you think about Murray the Cop. You think
Yeah.
about all the people who are on there playing poker every night. These shows are solid top to bottom. The writing is excellent. The characters are well formed. The situations are great.
Well, I think the MTM shows specialize in character. The comedy
Hmm.
came from the characters. You could put them on a desert island. You could put them in a Twilight Zone episode or what.
Yep.
It was based on the characters. With ABC and Gary Marshall's reign in the late 70s, because basically you had Leah, who was throughout the 70s, MTM throughout the 70s, but Marshall really, other than the Odd Couple, dominated the ratings in the late 70s. And his is basically more a throwback formula, like I said. That you have a buddy comedy in Laverne and Shirley. You have
Hmm.
the wacky alien comedy in Mork and Mindy. You
Hmm.
have the ensemble comedy in ABC. Although let's face it, Fonzie skyrocketed and became the
Yep.
biggest TV named character of
It's
that
the
decade,
Fonzie
probably.
show,
Yeah.
and also coins the
Hey.
phrase. Well, I'm thinking too of "jump the shark,"
Yeah,
which
yeah.
he didn't, which is never said in the series, but it becomes a motif of its own.
But then Norman Lear's show is basically the prototype of the sitcom or the show that's socially conscious. And
Yep.
so we start out with All in the Family, its spin-offs. You had Maude, you had the Jeffersons.
Hmm.
Maude then spins off Good Times, and
You've got Sanford and Son
Sanford and
over on
Son, which was
NBC.
one of the
Yeah.
few on NBC. Most of them were on
Hmm.
CBS, but Sanford and
Yep.
Son was on NBC. Um, let's talk a little bit about Lear, because he recently died within the last year. And interestingly enough, he's got mixed reviews. A lot of latter day black critics are very harsh on Lear, especially because of the way he treated a lot of the black people on, specifically the black shows on the Jeffersons and Good Times, not being claimed that he didn't give the rights or the proper revenue to people who wrote for those shows. That a lot of the actors there, especially Esther Roll and John Amos, felt
Hmm.
that he was giving the wrong message by favoring the wacky JJ character
Yep.
over some of the other characters. So let's talk about Lear, how as he was viewed then, which was very glowingly, and then how that's changed in the last 50
Hmm.
years.
Yeah, I think you could make an argument that Lear's shows have not perhaps aged as well as some of these other shows that we're talking about. I do a fair amount of surfing around on the interwebs and looking at what people are saying about various shows that have come out on DVD or that are on streaming services where they're being discovered by new generations of viewers. And you'll see that references to those shows and to MASH, by the way, which is a show we can probably get into as well, but shows that were very much of the time and the era. And I think that starting with Awe in the Family, but going through these other shows, these urban shows that we've been talking about, I almost look at them in the same way that people might look at a show like Amos and Andy. They're not as controversial, but you're going through this transitional point where you've got white men like Norman Lear doing shows about black culture, starring black actors. Today, you have entire networks that are devoted to black programming that is, by and large, produced, directed, written by black entertainers. So there's a very strong sense of culture that is all wrapped up in those shows. It's different when you look at something like Sanford and Son or the Jeffersons. There were people even then and now who would say that what these really are white conceptions of what black families are like. And in the case of the Jeffersons, where Esther Roll became so indignant about the elevation of JJ to the star of the show, the phenomenon itself is nothing new. As you mentioned, we saw something similar happen to the Fonzie character in Happy Days. But her specific objection was that we were playing into a stereotype here, and a bad stereotype of what white America or America in general saw and thought about black youth. That they were loud, they were always looking for an easy buck, an easy out, scheming, different things like this. And I think that there was a real concern that this was perpetuating that stereotype, if not encouraging young black males to adopt that kind of a persona. And so I don't know the actual reality of the effect it had. I was living in a small town at the time that a lot of these shows were on, so I didn't see the direct effect on a daily basis, but I know enough about what I've read regarding that effect that was a real concern. I think Esther Oll made some very good points in talking about the way she felt things should be portrayed. That's why she left the show. And so I think that these arguments are not without validity. And I think that the other things you were mentioning too about royalties, about control of the characters, control of the way they're portrayed, that that becomes a very touchy point as well. Um, part and parcel, because you're dealing again with some stereotypes out there, and whenever an actor begins to complain about the way they are portrayed in a show, they immediately face the prospect of being labeled as difficult to work with, or in a fight for control. Now, if you are somebody who is not a big star, that just increases it. And if you are not a big star, though you are becoming a big star, and you're also black, then you're playing right into some of the most negative stereotypes that you can have happen. So I think all of these things were at play at the same time. They were real concerns, but I think that as far as looking at the finished product, at what happened on television, I think the biggest concern is the image that it left on viewers. Now, I happen to think that Jefferson's, for example, it can be very funny. It's a black version of All in the Family, and I'm not sure that George Jefferson plays into any racial stereotype as much as he does the general stereotype of the person trying to make it big, the small man trying to become a big man, the modest businessman who wants to be respected for what he feels he has accomplished, the man who knows more than he thinks or thinks he knows more than he actually knows. If you listen to the old time radio shows like Fibber McGee and Molly, you might recognize some of Fibber McGee and George Jefferson. There's nothing racial about that, but it's especially at this point in time where you're talking about a transition in how blacks are being portrayed on television. You're talking about empowering blacks, black faces, black issues, black presence on television. Then it becomes something that you really have to be careful about, you have to look at.
Mitch, let's talk about the miniseries here, because when you're talking about blacks arriving on television, the 1970s was the decade that really sort of cemented them having a spot, at least. And the biggest by far was the Roots miniseries. And, the 1970s saw the rise of the miniseries. It saw the rise of telefilms. They became staples. We spoke briefly about that in the 60s with Emmy-winning shows like Brian's Song, and interesting all over the place telefilms. There was one I think called Mark IV about intelligent ants that wanted to take over the world. There were a few post-apocalyptic kind of telefilms. Then there were each of the networks had one or two nights where they would have broadcast movies. I remember the James Bond film
Hmm.
Goldfinger. I remember the Planet of the Apes making debuts and it being a big deal.
Yep.
Uh, um, as well as the perennials being aired, such as the Ten Commandments, and then later the Sound of Music. But Roots really, we had Rich Man Poor Man before that on PBS. There was I Claudius.
Hmm.
A little bit later, we had stuff like Shogun and whatnot. But really, when people think miniseries, they think Roots, the
Yeah.
original Roots with LeVar Burton as Kunta Kinte, John Amos from Good Times as the older
Hmm.
Kunta Kinte, uh, Ed Asner from Mary Tyler Moore, Robert Reed, I think, from the Brady Bunch was in that.
Everybody who
Yeah,
is anybody.
yeah, in the
Yeah.
70s, yeah. So if you can, talk a little bit about Roots, but more specific, more generally about the rise of miniseries and what led to its
Hmm.
eventual demise.
Well, I think what you have to take two steps back when you're talking about Roots to set the stage. The first miniseries on network television that we might recognize as a miniseries, um, I think that QB7 falls into that category. Now, it wouldn't be a miniseries by the way we define it because it was on two consecutive nights, but it ran for over 6 hours total.
Hmm.
So it was the network's decision, ABC's decision, that they played it up as the biggest made-for-TV movie in history, and that's why they ran it for 3 hours, 3.25 hours, and 3.5 hours. I think were the two nights that it was on. So it was going until midnight on the East Coast. Today, we would think of that more conventionally as a miniseries because it would probably be spread over 3 or 4 nights. But in terms of an extended drama, I think that becomes probably the first major one. I believe there was actually a two-part NBC made-for-TV movie before that called Vanished, which was a political thriller. And that might technically be the first miniseries in the sense that it ran for 2 nights. But leaving that aside, the first miniseries that comes the way we think of them was Rich Man, Poor Man. And that was a sensation, also on ABC. And that was a sensation. It was very well done. It had the big name cast, the sprawling epic story. It made stars out of its cast. It was on once a week, though. It was telecast in the same way that a normal series would be, one night a week, just like Masterpiece Theater, just like any other thing. It just happened to be for one season only, from by design. Roots, on the other hand, and there is the legend, which may or may not be true. I've read it both ways, but the concern at ABC was that Roots, which they had heavily spent on, which they were promoting, Roots might not attract a big audience. Their question is how many Americans are going to be interested in the long, sprawling, centuries long story of a black family that had its roots in Africa, comes to America through slavery, and progresses through to modern day. How many people are going to want to watch that? So, because of that, rather than scheduling Roots the way they did with Rich Man, Poor Man, they decided to show it on consecutive nights. I think it was over 8 nights, and there may have been one off night in between, but they ran that on consecutive nights for a week. And by the third or fourth episode, it was becoming obvious that this was a phenomenon. This was raking in audience numbers that nobody had ever seen for something like this before. And I remember, again, I was living in the small town. The viewers or readers from my blog will recognize I refer to it as the world's worst town because it had only one commercial television station. That was NBC at the height of their ratings disaster period. So we didn't get Roots where I lived back then, but it was becoming such a phenomenon that our high school had somebody recording it and was showing it to us on a 1 or 2 day tape delay in our history class. So that's how big a series it was. And because it was on night after night after night, the audience grew bigger and bigger and bigger every night, and it became a word of mouth phenomenon, and it introduced virtually every major star, especially black actors, talking about giving them the opportunities. Lou Gossett Jr., in addition to the others that you were mentioning, wins an Emmy for it, is magnificent in it. It's it is James Earl Jones, voice of God type of thing. So it's a great series, and it changes completely the whole perception of how a miniseries ought to be done. And from there on in, it becomes the rule rather than the exception that you're going to schedule these on consecutive nights, that they're going to take over an entire week, that they are going to be event programming. You're going to block out your whole week to watch this. You're going to watch Shogun. You're going to watch Holocaust. NBC creates an entire series based on miniseries, the closest thing that we've ever had to a masterpiece theater type of series, in the sense that it was planned from the beginning to be a run of limited series. You had The Captains and the Kings, which was outstanding. You had 3 other shows of steadily diminishing quality, but still reasonably good. On PBS, you have Masterpiece Theater, but you also have the Addams Chronicles, which is the first American-made miniseries, I think, that appears on PBS. It's on for the bicentennial year of 1976. It's based on the recently released Addams Family documents that they have at the Addams Library. So a lot of this information is new. It's got an outstanding cast, and it is an all-American production. So these are the heydays.
This is on the presidential family, not Gomez Addams.
That's correct. Yeah, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, all the way up through to the days of the education of Henry Adams and his brother, who was head of the Union Pacific Railroad. It's the story of an American family.
Yeah. So I did not know what QB7 was. That was a concentration camp drama.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, the crucial events of the story take place in a concentration camp, although the story itself is told in present day.
Now, it should be noted that Roots was on ABC, and I believe Rich Man Poor Man also was ABC.
On ABC,
so ABC again was showing itself to be easily the most innovative of the 3 networks.
Well, they coined this phrase that was kind of an overall umbrella package. Anytime they showed one of these miniseries, they referred to it as an ABC novel for television.
Yeah. So I want to sort of on par with that, what you mentioned about blocking out for miniseries. I think you said ABC had done that. In the early 70s, I think it was CBS, or was it NBC? I think it was CBS that had rotating series in the evenings. They had Columbo, McMillan and Wife.
NBC, the Wheel Show. Yes, the NBC.
What were the other
movie.
ones? It changed over the years.
Yep, you had 3 that were on there from the very beginning. You had Columbo, McMillan and Wife, and McCloud.
Yeah.
Now, of the 3, McCloud was actually the oldest because it had premiered the year before in a concept called 4 in 1, and that was not rotating in the same way, because in 4 in 1 you had 4 different programs. You had McCloud, I think San Francisco International, The Psychiatrist, and Night Gallery. And they would run 6 consecutive episodes over 6 weeks of each show. So you would see all of McCloud, then you'd see all of Night Gallery, then you'd see all of these other shows. The mystery movie concept, on the other hand, rotated them on a weekly basis. So this week you'd see Columbo, the next week you'd see McCloud, the week after that you'd see McMillan. And then they had that fourth one that they never really did find an adequate show to fill it. I think for 2 years they had Heck Ramsey with Richard Boone, which was by far, I think, the best of the temporary, if you will, shows that didn't run for the entire course. But you also had a wheel show called The Bold Ones, which I think started in the late '60s, where you had one episode or one segment concerned doctors, one segment concerned lawyers, the third segment concerned a politician. It was the senator with Hal Holbrook, and that was the most critically acclaimed, although the doctors was the one that ran the longest. You had a series called The Name of the Game, which was another wheel series that starred three people who worked for a publishing company. You had Gene Barry, who was the head of the publishing company. You had Robert Stack, who was one of the writers. You had Tony Franciosa, who was another one of the writers. And every week they rotated as the leads. They all worked for Gene Barry, so it was his company, but he wasn't in every episode. The only character who was Susan St. James, who was Barry's secretary, who would interact with all of the other characters. But that's this wheel idea, which enabled them to do 90-minute episodes every week. But because of the rotating cast, they were able to keep things going by filming maybe a couple of episodes at the same time. Otherwise, they never would have been able to carry that kind of a load with that kind of cast for that length of time.
So it seems to me, we talked about the rural purge. Part of that was also the dying off of the westerns, which dominated the 50s and 60s. But it seems to me that people, there was also, they don't talk about sort of the stagnation of television drama, plain old drama there. And by that I mean, you had, we talked a little bit about, when we talked about Quinn Martin, you had shows like The Streets of San Francisco or The Rookies, or what was the one in the Firehouse?
Yep.
You had
Firehouse, yeah.
Yeah. You had outliers like the Rockford Files, which I think was a great show and innovative, but doctor shows started to get stale, Marcus Welby and whatnot. But this saw, I think, a trend that started in the early '70s and really dominated dramas in the '70s. That's the family drama. It started with shows like The Waltons, which actually survived the rural purge.
Yes.
Little House on the Prairie, and The Waltons was CBS, NBC for Little House. You had Eight is Enough on ABC. You also had Family, which made Christine McNichol a star, and a couple of others here.
There was a show called Apple's Way on CBS that they tried to make as a Waltons wannabe, but it never caught on. But it was part of that same genre.
And I think the two that were the best, Eight is Enough was basically an extended sitcom almost, and Little House on the Prairie, that was to me a little bit too heavy-handed with the moralism. But the two best and easily the most best were the Waltons. Earl Hamner, his narration, the writing, the development. Richard Thomas was, I still think, I'd say he's a top 10 actor in those first 5 years. The Waltons was a great show.
And Ralph Waite, Michael Learned, Will Geer,
And then Family was, I think, the first modern show, a set in the modern era that really had a grip of the tenor of the time. There was a show, I think it was called James at 15 with Lance Kerwin, which was also a pretty innovative and good show. 15 years before the one with Claire Danes, what was it called?
So-Called Life.
My So-Called Life. But to me, the Waltons and Family were the two best pure dramas, and they dealt with the characters. They were the characters were the best written. Sada Thompson, I think, was the mother on Family, and I forget who the father was.
Broderick.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about that sort of mini movement of families at the center of family dramas, and maybe the Waltons and Family specifically.
Well, I think, sociologists would probably say that part of the popularity of these shows went back to a desire for, my friend David Hofstede calls this comfort TV, but I think shows that provided a sense of stability and tranquility. Remember, we had gone through Vietnam, we had gone through Watergate. We were the inflation rate was 19% at that time. We were in a pretty traumatic time in this country's history, and there was this desire to look back at a more gentle time, a simpler time, but not to do it in the same way that you might with sitcoms, but to do it in a more dramatic way with real characters facing real issues. So in family, for example, you have all the kinds of contemporary issues that people would be that a family would be facing. You have marital problems, you have health problems, you have discord, you have people striving to try to achieve things. These are all things that viewers would relate to, but it's not done in a controversial, confrontational manner. It's done, if anything, it might have had a slightly soap opera element to it in that it was somewhat serialized. But the point is that it is the kind of television that you can watch, that the family may be able to watch, that is going to be digestible without feeling like it's dumbing things down. Now, I think Little House on the Prairie and the Waltons are similar to that, but where those are both period shows, what they strive to do in some way is to remind people that problems are never new. They're just cast differently. So there was a war in the Waltons. It wasn't Vietnam, it was World War II. There were hard times. It wasn't in 19% inflation, it was the Depression. In A Little House on the Prairie, you see similar types of things. Being a pioneer is not an easy thing, especially in Minnesota. But the strength of the family is what gets these people through. That's a reassuring message at a time when the family unit seems to be under great attack and great uncertainty. You have the generation gap, you have birth control, you have abortion, you have all the divorce, drugs, all these things that are putting pressure on families or tearing them apart. And these family dramas are enabling people to be able to watch something like this, to identify with them, to give them something to strive for, or to remind them, to coin one of these corny expressions of the time, that tough times never last, but tough people do. But it's done in a way that is 180 degrees from what you might have seen on the Beverly Hillbillies or Green Acres. It's done more seriously so that maybe people don't feel ashamed or embarrassed to be watching them. And it's appealing to a different demographic. Family, yes, but an urban family as well as a rural family. I often wonder, actually, by the way, what would have happened with the rural purge if the war had, if all the turmoil and everything had come a few years earlier, or if the rural purge had come a few years later. Would the Beverly Hillbillies have been seen as absolutely too corny in the mid-70s, or would it have been seen as that kind of comfort food that people really wanted to watch because they didn't want to be confronted by the grittiness of everyday life? And we'll see that in some of the crime dramas we might touch on, for example. But I think it's a form of escapism that is different from what we would see in fantasy or science fiction.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Lucille Ball soon because I think Lucille Ball, at her career arc, is sort of like the Beverly Hillbillies in that her shows were never really grounded in a time or a place. Whereas, and I think we've talked about this before, was I prefer Jackie Gleason and
Hmm.
his characters all inhabited certain social niches that didn't. But before we get too far afield, I think one of the things that for me separates the Waltons from the other dramas, accepting family, but especially since both the Waltons and Little House on the Prairie are often put together in people's minds as being, about those people in the past who were blah blah blah. But the difference is, I believe the Ingalls Wilder show here, Little House, was set in the 1870s, 1880s, something like that.
That
Where,
sounds, yeah.
yeah, whereas the 1930s were the time for the Waltons.
Hmm.
When both of those shows aired, the Waltons were in living memory. I remember my
Yes.
dad talk, even though my dad grew up in New York City in the Great Depression, he could relate to the Waltons. Aside from I think qualitative stuff in terms of the writing, I think that's one of the reasons that the Waltons I think was the bigger show in terms of
Hmm.
its overall social impact. And if you think about it now, we're farther away from when the Waltons aired than the Waltons was from when it was
Yeah.
set.
That's remarkable to think of it that way. And one thing you mentioned that just struck a thought in me too is that people were able to relate to the Waltons because the Depression was in living memory, and it's not unlike the popularity of some of the World War II series of the '60s,
Yeah.
even treading into the early '70s, perhaps. But Combat, McHale's Navy, Hogan's
Rat
Heroes,
Patrol.
man, yes, those the some of the biggest 12 o'clock high, some of the biggest fans of shows like that were men who had fought in the war, women who had been at home while they were going on. Veterans related to those kinds of shows, and they liked them. Even a show like Hogan's Heroes was tremendously popular with World War II veterans because they understood that there was humor implicit even in that. But I think you're drawing a parallel there, that these certain shows may be set in the past, but not so far away that people can't understand or relate to them because they lived through them themselves.
Yeah, and it started the trend with the Earl Hamner intros and outros to each episode. It started the trend that would be picked up later by the Wonder Years. I think
Hmm.
Everybody Hates Chris, the Chris Rock thing, and a number of other shows that have come and gone since. But um, I just wanted to ask because, as I had mentioned, I think that Richard Thomas is one of the spectacularly great actors on television, and yet he spent most of his career after the Waltons on stage. And from what I've heard, he's a fine stage actor. But I just wonder. He was such a big star. He was so identified with the role, and I saw a clip of him recently in the last year or two saying that he now regrets having left it after 5 years because
Hmm.
I think there was a severe qualitative decline. Yes, the two grandparents, one had a stroke, the other died, and so the show obviously is going to change and evolve. But even when you see some of the later shows, and they had I forget the actor's name who played John Boy 2.0, it just wasn't ever the same without Richard Thomas.
Yeah, there are, people would say the same thing, I think, in a different sense about Andy Griffith, that once
Mm.
Don Knotts left that series as Barney Fife, there was something that happened to the show because of it. And
I
whether,
pity Ken Berry. Poor Ken
oh,
Berry. He gets
he
blamed
had
with
a
that.
tough.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing, just to take a brief tangent here, Ken Berry always wanted to be a song and dance
Yeah.
man, and that's actually how he saw himself. And he winds up at some point in time getting a variety series of his own called The Ken Berry Wow Show. And when you look at what he was in between F Troop and Mayberry RFD and these other shows for which he's probably better known,
Mama's Family.
yep, it's ironic because that really is not what he wanted to do, and
Yeah.
it's not how he saw himself. So, I think that certainly are a lot of stories of shows that have suffered because one of the leads goes, even if they're only in a supporting role. And for whatever reason, sometimes that works for the actor. They go on to become a big star in motion pictures, or they wind up having a very successful series of their own. Then, on the other hand, you have David Caruso's, who
Yeah.
never are able to recover. Then you have someone like Richard Thomas, or I would even suggest somebody like Donny Osmond, who never really was taken seriously as an entertainer for all of the success he had until he got on Broadway with Joseph and the
Yeah.
Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You have that kind of shift in genres that sometimes is necessary to prolong a career.
Well, I'll give you an even more extreme example. I'd say Sean Cassidy. He was on the
Yeah.
Hardy Boys originally. He was Do Run Run Run. I remember my sister had his record. So he was a typical Tiger Beat poster boy in the late 70s. The
Mm-hmm.
younger brother of David Cassidy, who was a superstar
Yeah.
for young girls in the earlier 70s. And yet he's carved out quite a niche for himself as a producer of a lot of quality television over the last 40 years.
Yeah, Ivan Dixon did the same thing. When he left Hogan's Heroes, he went into directing and had a very good career in that. Then, of course, you've got a real outlier. I always like to think of was Denzel Washington,
Mm.
who did not leave Saint Elsewhere. But if you were to look at that entire cast of Saint Elsewhere over the run of its show, you would place Denzel Washington's character somewhere in the lower part of significance as it related to the show. I've often wondered in retrospect how many people watching Saint Elsewhere would have picked out Denzel and said, there's a man who is going to have a mantle full of Academy Awards someday.
Mm.
For all of the actors on that show, he not only has gone on to great things, but he's had an extraordinary career, one of the great actors of our recent generation. So there's an example of someone who really made the transition from TV to the movies and succeeded.
So I want to talk about several shows here, and I want to talk about them because they all aired on the same night on the same network. And I often get into these arguments with people who tell me that the last few years, although now people are saying cable television has gone to shit, but the golden age of television. For me, it's always been the mid '60s to 1980s, and I think you
Hmm.
might have been on that show I did a few years
Yes.
back about that. So here is the ABC Friday night lineup. I'm going to give you two separate networks and lineups. Friday night in the early '70s, eight. This is Eastern time. 8 o'clock, The Brady Bunch. 8:30, The Partridge Family. 9 o'clock, Room 222. 9:30, The Odd Couple, and 10 p.m. an hour-long Love American Style. So this is a comedy lineup there, and I want to talk about each of these shows just briefly as we go through. Now, we talked about the big three: MTM, Lear, and Gary Marshall. You could somehow put Sherwood Schwartz in as not quite at their level, but he did have two pretty good medium-sized hits in Gilligan's Island and The Brady Bunch,
Hmm.
which have grown outsized reputations in the decades since. Gilligan's Island arguably is, along with I Love Lucy, the most rerun show of all time,
Hmm.
and The Brady Bunch had so many spin-offs. It's played on off-Broadway, off-Broadway. It's been parodied online ceaselessly. Marsha, Marsha, Marsha is right up there with Hey, the Fonz.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, the Brady Bunch. Let's talk about that first. It's Sherwood Schwartz's. For me, it's Sherwood Schwartz's Aesop's Fables because I look at it and I wonder why does this show work so much better now? And I
Hmm.
think it really, putting aside the cheese factor, I think all of them are these little Aesopian fables about, you should treat your neighbor right. You shouldn't pull your sister's pigtail. You should be polite to the hired help kind of thing. And while it seems corny, and it is corny to a certain extent, I think it does it with a fairly straight face, and it works because it works on the level of a children's television show without even trying. And we'll talk about some children's television in a bit. But what is your take on the outsized success of the Brady Bunch, which was a moderate hit, if you will, at
Yeah.
most?
Well, you're right that it took on a life of its own, just like Gilligan's Island, once it went into syndication, and people began to see it in either after school time slots or other times of the day. That's how I watched Gilligan's Island. I don't remember it at all from when it was on originally, although I was alive. But it was after school when I would see it, and I think you've touched on something there with the Brady Bunch, particularly these little morality plays almost, because you've got two very credible, very well-liked actors in the lead. You have Robert Reed, who is so good in The Defenders, and he's now going on to comedy, which is very interesting. You've got Florence Henderson, who has made it all the way from the Today Show to the Wesson Oil commercials and the Bell Telephone Hour. And I mean, people love Florence Henderson. And so you have two very credible, very warm adults in the lead, and you have these six kids they form a blended family. And nowadays, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the families had a divorce rather than a widower type of situation. But otherwise, blended families are something that people can understand now even more than they could back then. And it's all about trying to get along together. And you have these issues of establishing trust, establishing respect, learning to get along with relatives who aren't really relatives, but you're all thrown in under the same roof. And you've got a new mom or a new dad, and you have brothers or sisters who aren't really related to you, but they are. And it's all about learning to treat them and stick up for them and love them like blood family, and to learn these little lessons that maybe in the case of Mike's family, where you've got all males, maybe some of these lessons on how to treat your sister, or some of the other more domesticating types of lessons, wouldn't have been as readily available to them living in an all-male household. On the other hand, with Carol's family, where you've got all the girls, there are lessons there as well. Not chauvinistic or stereotypical lessons, but lessons on what what boys are like, what their instincts are, what it's like living around them, the preparations for both the sexes for getting ready to be adults. And yet it's not done in a moralizing or a preachy way. It is sort of in a subversive way. I think we alluded to that once with Gilligan's Island, how Sherwood Schwartz had that ability to put in a little subversive message in there. And I think it might exist at the Brady Bunch. But what you have more than anything else are adolescents facing issues that all adolescents can identify with. And who among us wasn't an adolescent at one time? We understand what it's like about worrying about having pimples break out the night before the prom, or not being able to get the keys to the car, or being nervous about asking someone on a date, whether you're worried about your grades or your appearance, or who has the bigger bedroom, or who's the favored child, or anything like that. These were all lessons that people understood, that they lived through, that they recognized, and it was being presented to them by an immensely likable cast in a way that they could identify with. And rather, the clothes may be dated, the fashions, the colors, those things are dated. The messages are not dated. As I said, if anything, they may be even more relevant today than they were back then.
And I don't think they ever named the first spouses. I
No,
think both of them.
or what happened to them.
Yeah. Well, I think wasn't Florence Henderson's. I think she was a widow. I
Yeah.
believe. I don't think we know whether Robert Reed's character was a divorcee, but we never hear about them.
No.
The other earlier spouses, even if they were alive, never came to visit. So in this way too, it's sort of bubbled off to me in a sort of a fantasy, fabulous way, because it's not a realistic blended family.
No, it's certainly geared, I think, in that sense, more toward the troubles of the children, because a serious series would certainly deal with the anniversary of your spouse's death, or the
Yeah.
anniversary of when you were married, or simply looking at a picture in a scrapbook and having a flood of memories come across them. We never
Yeah.
see that. So it's not really the parents' problems we're concerned
Right.
with. Well, it's the children's issues and the way in which the parents deal with them.
And after that came the Partridge Family on that night, and the
Yep.
Partridge Family was sort of an odd reworking of both the monkeys, and we had a fictional group here. It was based on the Cowsills, a
Hmm.
family singing group from the late '60s, early '70s. Most famous nowadays, I think, that they did the song "Hair." They did the singles version of the song "Hair," um, and it's also a show where I believe Mrs. Partridge is definitely called a widow,
Yeah,
but we don't
I
know
think you're
anything.
right.
Again, we don't know anything about the kid's family, and the two breakout stars comedically are the red-haired kid who played Danny Bonaducci,
Bonaducci, yep.
but then there was, like I said, he was the Tiger Beat supernova. I mean, David Cassidy
Hmm.
was literally up there with Led Zeppelin and these hard rock groups in terms of selling out arena rock
Yeah.
forums. Um, uh, and that ran, I think, 1 year after the Brady Bunch. It might have ended the same year. I think that might have only been 4 seasons. Maybe it was five. So talk these two series in my mind have always been pushed together because they air back to back.
Hmm.
Um, what is what is your comment on it? Because I don't think I think the Partridge Family in some aspects was a better written show and a better acted show, but it doesn't have it doesn't
Right.
have the longer staying ability that the Brady Bunch had.
It has a certain datedness to it, not because of the music, the idea of the bus that's got the paint job on it. It is perhaps more than the Brady Bunch a product of its time, but what it does have is Shirley Jones,
Yeah.
who has, speaking of Academy Awards, has one on her mantle as well, and going into a comedic role, but she is, I think, the epitome of the cool mom. Who would not want to have, in a sense, I mean, yes, when you're a teen, you're getting into that time where you don't want to be around your parents. You want to establish your own life. But in another sense, who wouldn't want to have the cool mom who's the lead singer in your garage band, who is as hip and with it in many ways as anybody else? And yet at the same time, she's still your mom. You're going to have the same kinds of problems that you have with her, but there's something about having her on the road with you that is both a comfort and a distraction. You're enabled and you're restrained at the same time. It's an interesting concept, and Danny Bonaducci was kind of the kid you love to hate in some ways too.
Mm.
I know that I don't mean personally necessary, but he did have a character who was not the quintessential sweet little boy.
Yeah.
It was kind of refreshing to see a kid with an attitude like that. And Dave Madden, the group's manager, you had some very interesting family dynamics involved in this series as it was, because of course David Cassidy was Shirley Jones' stepson, and was the son of Jack Cassidy, the actor, and who a fine dramatic and musical comedy actor who sadly had a very difficult time with David's stardom, and felt a certain amount of jealousy over his stardom, and that was part of what played into his problems with drugs and alcohol and different things like that he felt there was a competition going, and that he wasn't really being recognized for some of the fine work he had done. If you look at Columbo, he's one of the great villains on that series, and I've always felt kind of bad about that, because he played a lot of obnoxious characters you love to hate, but there was no denying his talent, and it is too bad that that was the kind of thing that would have done him in.
Now, I believe we spoke of Room 222 in the show we did on the 60s, or we briefly. That's probably the least known of this
Yeah.
run of shows here 50 years on. Any brief comments about it?
I think one of the reasons maybe that it is not as well known as the others is because it really straddled the lines. It was a comedy drama or a dramedy,
Yeah.
if they had coined the phrase back then.
I think
And
didn't that phrase come with that show Hooperman?
yeah,
By
Hooperman, I think you're
John
probably
John
right,
Ritter.
somewhere in
Yeah.
that area. But it was what we would call a dramedy. And I suppose Karen Valentine was one of the big breakout stars of that, but it had a very solid cast. I always liked Michael Constantine.
Yeah.
I enjoyed his cynicism. But I think that one of the reasons it doesn't last is because it made its relevancy more overt. And maybe you can't help but do that in a school drama. I think Mr. Novak is the same kind of challenge. But I don't think that 222 had that timelessness or that sense of not preaching to the audience that the other shows did, and that may be why it isn't as well remembered. I don't know.
Yeah. Now, The Odd Couple, as we mentioned, was Gary Marshall's first real hit. It gave the first exposure to his sister as Myrna Turner. What's her name? Penny Marshall.
Yes.
And it comes close to the Brady Bunch in terms of adaptations. It had a late 70s television cartoon version with dogs as the odd couple. It had the Black Odd Couple with Ron Glass from Barney Miller and Demond Wilson from Sanford and Son as Felix and Oscar, respectively. It had a short rebirth for 3 or 4 seasons in the last decade, the teens, and obviously came from Neil Simon's original brilliant play and had a film. So it probably is number 2 in terms of known quantity with the Brady Bunch. I think though Klugman and Randall, who were both Randall was known for light comedy, Klugman was known for dramas.
Yes.
But I've often said I never really believed Jack Klugman as a particularly dramatic actor. He's a little bit on the hammy side. When he's in his role as Oscar, though, it's absolute gold. And the two of them together, I mean, they could be in any situation. And people will rag about the first year because they used the movie set and they didn't do it in front of a live audience. But there's not. I mean, the top 10 episodes come from the later 4 years. But there's really not a bad episode throughout the whole 5 years.
No,
and they learned we got 5 years. We're at the top of the game. Let's end it. They ended it, and they had one of my favorite endings to the show ever. So, what is your brief take on The Odd Couple?
Well, I think you're right that the actors lobbied to get rid of the laugh track with that series and to film it in front of a live studio audience, and that was one of the first series that really where that was overtly being debated, that they even did one episode without the laugh track at all to get the audience reaction to it. But the Klugman and Randall play off of each other so perfectly that there are many people who prefer the TV series to the movie, to the Broadway play, and that's unusual because both the play and the movie had outstanding casts as well. But you can't really cast a TV series better than those two leads, and I think that I always talk about timelessness, and I think that's important when you're looking at why a show can sustain itself. It's timeless either because its messages and its stories are timeless, or because it is in a period of time like World War II, that has become historical and in that sense frozen in time. But I think the Odd Couple has all of those elements, plus it is smart, intelligent literate writing, witty. Um, the quotes, about between FU stands for Felix Unger and linguini, not spaghetti, and all of these different kinds of things. Who can't appreciate and identify with something or other from one of those characters? They're just, you're right that it was never an enormous hit, but there really is not a false note in it.
Yeah. If you assume, you make an ass of you and me. you know, uh, but one of the things that I think it did well was it worked in guest stars flawlessly. Howard Cosell, previously mentioned, it brought in the lead ballet dancer for the Met. It brought in an opera singer. It brought in Gene Simmons, not from Kiss, but the actress from the 40s and 50s, as in a real one of the best.
Certainly, one of the most memorable episodes of all was the Password episode with Alan
Betty
Ludden
White
and Betty
Alan
White.
Ludden,
Aristophanes. Which is a great punchline in any situation.
One of the most popular episodes that I've seen online is the Roy Clark episode where he does his virtuoso guitar playing from Hee Haw. Roy Clark, a forgotten phenomenal musician.
It never feels forced to introduce these guest stars into the because it's all plausible.
Because Oscar is likely going to know Howard Cosell, for example. Now, Love American Style is also not as well known as the Partridge, Brady Bunch, or Odd Couple, but it sort of spins off of a lot of European movies of the 1960s, something Italian style, Love American Style, and you had these blackout sketches bracketing, maybe a 15 or 20 minute longer sketch. And this, again, was almost like a precursor to the Love Boat because they all had people falling in or out of love or the trials and tribulations. What is your thoughts about that show?
I think it's a comedy of manners in many respects, and I think one of the reasons why it may not be as well remembered by people at large, although its fans certainly remember it, but I think that some of the situations you see in it perhaps are dated in the sense that today's audiences might have a hard time understanding why such and such might have been such a big deal. That's what I say with being a comedy of manners. So many of the sexual mores of the time aren't applicable anymore, and so you don't understand why people were so concerned about some of the things that are happening. But it had some terrific guest shots from people. It had the guest stars. The writing could be very funny. But I think precisely because of its episodic nature, it doesn't fit easily into the kind of thing that can be syndicated. I know that the show went between half-hour and hour-long versions. So you have to kind of chop things up if you're going to run it out as a half an hour syndicated show. There was a certain salacious aspect to it that probably keeps it from being shown in that after-school type of time slot that we've talked about with shows like Gilligan's Island. So there may be those things going against it, but on the other hand, when you look back at the message boards that I see of people talking about classic television, it's not up there in the top 10, but it certainly is far from being forgotten by people who remember it.
I wanted to also now switch over to another great night, and probably the greatest night of television ever put together on network TV or any kind of TV, all on CBS, Saturdays on CBS in the early 70s. You had All in the Family at 8, you had MASH at 8:30, Mary Tyler Moore at 9, Bob Newhart at 9:30, and then you top it off with Carol Burnett. I mean, this is I think the greatest comedy line. I mean, all four of those sitcoms are top 20 easily, and if you throw in just broad comedy, you got 5 of the top 25 shows I think that have ever been on.
Now, Murderers Row.
Yeah, All in the Family. I mean, I don't know what more we can say about that show. Its innovation.
Trailblazing,
Yeah, if you just have a quick opining on it.
trailblazing and yet funny.
Yeah.
And I think that somebody mentioned that deep down, behind all the division and all the shouting and all the arguments, these were four people who really did love each other. It was a little hard for Archie to show it sometimes, but when push came to shove, that did hold that family together.
Now, MASH is a very divisive show because it ran 3.5 times the length of the Korean War. It was really about the Vietnam War. It was based on the book. I forget the author. The film.
Hooker, wasn't it? Was it Richard Robert Hooker, somebody like that?
Hooker, I think. Yeah, and then the film by Robert Altman. And people will talk about the first 3 years as the golden years. What, as I say, with Woody Allen, the early funnier shows with Trapper John on it, with Henry Blake on it, and with Larry Linville, who lasted a season or two more. And then you have they switch gears. We get Potter, we get BJ, we get who's the insufferable New England fellow.
David Ogden.
David Ogdenstein is
Honeycutt. No, that's BJ.
That's BJ.
Winchester. Charles Winchester.
Charles Emerson Winchester. And the only female character has a nice arc over all of it. But people will talk about it got very preachy at times. Alan Alda, who was Mr. Sensitive of the 1970s, a lot of things might have gone to his head directing-wise or whatnot. But still, it's a show that did things no other show did. There's that episode with the dreams, with each of the character dreams, and then you have symbolic. You had no laugh track for the last half of the show. It evolved away from that. You went from it's a show that had a lot of flaws in a lot of ways, but its pluses far outweighed its flaws.
Yeah, you had the black and white episode, the newsreel version, the one that was done in real time.
Yeah.
I think that MASH, at its best, was one of the best shows on television, and I am not a fan of Alan Alda myself. Not the man. I don't have anything against him personally. I've never been a big fan of his as an actor. But I think that the point is that, like many series, I don't remember who this is attributed to, but many people have said it over the years that 50% of what you do with a long-running series, 50% is average, and 25% of it is dreck. But the other 25% is pure gold. Yeah. And I think that's probably what you would say about MASH, that when it was on its game, when it was functioning on all cylinders, it was doing things that no other show, comedy or drama, was doing at the time. And I think that some of the cast changes actually worked out for the best. There weren't any egregious changes. We talk sometimes about how Andy Griffith, we mentioned, suffered because of the Barney Fife character left. But when they replaced characters in MASH, they were at the very worst, in many cases, lateral moves.
Yeah. I think Frank Burns was just he was a limited character. I think Winchester opened that up.
Mm-hmm. And he's such a gifted actor anyway that he was able to bring a certain gravitas to that role where he wasn't really a fool. He was pompous, he was this and he was that. But the question was, if you were on the operating table and he was standing over you, how would you feel about him as a surgeon? And I think, and the episode where he's creating music with the North Korean prisoners showed that he had a depth and a gravitas that was unusual for a sitcom. And I think all of the characters, to a certain extent, were able to do that. I think Mike Farrell was a good replacement for Wayne Rogers. I think that Harry Morgan was a rare note of sanity in that series, but he always has been able to play off other characters. If you ever read about him personally as an actor, there are very few things that ever troubled him, whether it was working on Dragnet, where he was being micromanaged by Jack Webb, or on Pete and Gladys, where Carl Williams was notoriously difficult to work with. Nothing ever really seemed to rattle him, and he brings that quality into the series as well, I think.
I think we mentioned in talking about Hawaii Five-O how in the early seasons they had some yellow face white actors. We
Hmm.
never had that in MASH, so that's
No.
a plus on its side too. So if All in the Family and MASH were the hour of social comedy, the next hour with Mary Tyler Moore and Bob Newhart was the character-driven hour. And you know, I would give a slight edge, I think, to Newhart as the better show
Hmm.
myself. Simply, but it's really toss a coin. I think for me, I think of all of those characters on both shows, Bob Newhart was the best comedian, and there was something about his relationship with Suzanne
Hmm.
Pleshette, which to me was at the time and in the decades since one of the most realistic portrayals of a marriage.
Yes.
I mean, yes, you could say she was out of his league because she was gorgeous, but he was he was the kind of man that I think most women would be attracted to, rather than
Hmm.
say the Alan Alda character, who was sort of the pompous, wimpy kind of guy.
Yeah, he was the Mel Brooks, and she was the Anne Bancroft. And I think Anne Bancroft said once that what made her fall in love with Mel Brooks was that he made her laugh. And you can see that same kind of dynamic here. That you want to think of Bob Hartley as must be the luckiest man on the face of the earth to be in the situation he's in. But the dynamics between the two of them were perfectly complementary, and the chemistry was just fantastic. And as I mentioned earlier, the writing is smart, it's witty. The characters are memorable, especially the patients, who all bring their own characteristics to it. So you have those moments of wackiness that Newhart is so good at playing off of. When you look at his stand-up act and you watch him, particularly the telephone bit that he did so well, and you see how he's always reacting to situations, even if the characters he's reacting to are in his own mind. You never hear them, but they become so real when he does that bit that you can even hear what they're saying, even though they're not present. And to give him all of these patients who obviously have some kind of situation they're struggling with, or they wouldn't be seeing him in the first place. But that just allows him to react and to play off of all of these people so well. And I would agree with you that I think it is the better of the two shows, which is like saying is something like an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. I think Newhart is slightly better. I will always have a certain affection for Mary Tyler Moore, being
Yeah.
that I lived in Minneapolis when the show was on the air. So it's always a bit of a hometown experience for me. But I think there's something about Newhart that is just almost unable to repeat.
And one of the things that is sort of undernoted is that Bob Newhart had a character who was a recurring character, one of his patients, that was, I think, the first portrayal of a gay man on a show. In only maybe about 7 or 8 episodes, Howard Hessman, who later became Dr. Johnny
Hmm.
Fever on WKRP, which is another great show that
Yes.
we're probably not going to get too in depth here, but maybe in the 80s we'll talk about it. But uh, and Bob, even though he's an enlightened man of the Vietnam era, is kind of put off when he gets this character in there, and a lot of the other patients don't want to be in the group discussion with him, but then they
Hmm.
finally come around. So I think I don't know if you remember that episode, but it's one of the more interesting episodes because
Yeah.
it deals with a little bit of the hypocrisy that Bob as a doctor has.
And it allows him to grow as a human being within the context of his character and some of the other characters as well. It gives him that chance anyway throughout that arc, and I think that's very natural. You have to watch the show and appreciate it as a show of its time,
Yeah.
as opposed to perhaps today. But whereas that would date many situations, what it does here is it allows you to see the evolution of a character or of a situation or of the way things are in general.
And WKOP, I think, was an MTM show. Maybe the last
I
one
believe you're correct.
with last hit one. And I think I was wrong because Trapper John is actually a spin-off of MASH. So technically, it's I think it might have come after Lou Grant, maybe a season later. But
those are apples and oranges, though.
Right,
I think
right.
With the characters.
Yeah. And then finally, that night ends with the hour-long Carol Burnett show, and Carol Burnett is sort of the spiritual successor to Lucille Ball as America's favorite redhead.
Last great variety show.
Yeah, I mean the Tara, she in the portrayal of what Gone with the Wind, and she's wearing the
something I just saw on the wind.
Right. She's wearing the draperies. Yeah, and so I mean, you show me where you have 5, Hall of Fame comedy shows on, and then you talk to me about the golden age that we're in.
What's so interesting about that is that I don't watch TV on Saturday nights. I mean, we go to our DVD stash of series and movies, and so unless there's some kind of a sporting event or something major going on, we don't watch the regular television on Saturday night. So I don't know the way it is now, but a few years ago, none of the networks were programming original shows on Saturday night. They were either showing repeats of shows that were still on the air. They'd created a time spot for the best of, or they were showing sporting events themselves. But there was nothing in terms of original scripted programming on Saturday nights because nobody was home to see them. And to talk to people who aren't familiar with the 70s and to explain to them that there was a time, once upon a time, that you would stay home on Saturday to watch television, or if you were going out somewhere, it was to be with friends who you'd watch those shows with. It's remarkable to think how good that night of television was and how different it is today.
Now, another person that we've spoken of before, and I want to touch on, I just mentioned Lucille Ball, and I think we spoke maybe in the 60s with her last major show. She had a couple of clunkers that only lasted a few episodes. Here's Lucy. I wish that Lucille Ball had hooked up with Norman Lear, because I think older Lucy with that even more gravelly voice, with her age showing, would have been a perfect vehicle. Would have been a perfect star to be with a Norman Lear type show.
I agree.
As a female kind of Archie Bunker. The show itself, in the first season or two, which had her real kids, did do a few shows with. I guess you call it the flower power kind of sensibility that showed a little bit of hint of what that show could have been. But getting back to what we said about the Odd Couple, that perfectly worked in their guest stars, I think Here's Lucy just evolved into a show where every other week there was, Liz, Elizabeth Taylor or this guy, and
John Wayne,
and the Lucy character was just meeting these characters simply because I redeemed a cereal box top or something, and I'm going to meet John Wayne or whatever the hell the premise was. It just became ridiculous, and I really think that's one of the shows that really wasted what could have been a good premise, or it did have a good initial premise, but had she been in a Leah type comedy, I think it could have been as memorable as her first show, I Love Lucy.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think you're right about that, and I don't know if that was a business decision on her part or if it was the network saying that they didn't want something like that we want I Love Lucy. But I think that is a very intriguing concept.
So I want to talk about just a couple of other things here. And one is the trend that with both Sanford and Son and All in the Family that we had of the importing of British television shows to America. Now we had on PBS, we had that. We'd had Doctor Who. My first Doctor Who was not Tom Baker, but the guy before him, Pertwee.
John
Pertwee. And people always say the first Doctor Who is the one that you love the most. I liked Pertwee, but Tom Baker, I mean, come on. And I've seen a few of the shows. Tom Baker, to me, is always going to be Doctor Who. But
Yes. Well, in my study, I've got the library here, but in my study, you'll see not only the Tom Baker scarf hanging on the coat rack, but you'll see for buco bucks.
Yeah.
Having arrived in the mail just last month in this very envelope that I've got down here is my autographed picture from Tom Baker. So that tells you what how I feel about him. He is the to quote himself in one of those episodes, you may be a doctor, but I am the doctor, the definitive article.
Well, it's hard for me to think of an actor in any English language based television show that I've ever seen. Maybe McGowan in The Prisoner, but that made more from less. Doctor Who in the mid '70s. I mean, with Pertwee, they were doing location film, so it had a bit of a cinema verite feel to it. You've rarely had that. Maybe in just 2 minutes in the beginning and the end of a half-hour show. It was all these cheesy costumes that were from a 1950s sci-fi B film. But the writing was so good, and Baker elevated the writing. I mean, it's to me one of the great acting performances of all time. Now, having said that, I mentioned Sanford and Son, which came from Steptoe and Son, All in the Family, which came from what was the name of the original show?
Till Death Us Do Part.
Yeah. And there were other shows throughout the '70s that tried drafting this, but they never had the success of those two Lear shows. No. Why do you think? Do you think that All in the Family and Sanford and Son, the concepts were just too good, and the rest of them were just bad, or were they just outliers?
It was a combination of things, I think. You had extremely talented casts in both of those shows, particularly Carroll O'Connor. If you look at some of his work prior to All in the Family, some of the dramatic roles he played, both on television and in the movies, he's a wonderfully sinister character in the Lee Marvin film Point Blank, for instance. So I think that, and of course, you see it again later on when he acts in The Heat of the Night. So O'Connor gives the role a certain gravitas and plausibility, but everybody in this country understands what an Archie Bunker is. And I think everybody understood the Fred Sanford mentality as well. Some of the imports have such a uniquely British angle to things that I think it becomes difficult to duplicate them. And then there are those
Faulty Towers. They did a version here.
That just is not going to work in an Americanized version. Then you've got a show, I will say, for example, The Saint. You've got Roger Moore, who I think is perfectly cast as the Saint. Why would you need to do an American version of it when you've got Roger Moore?
And it was broadcast in the U.S., so...
Yep, exactly. That, and of course you had The Prisoner, and you had other shows, Strange Report, that were imports, or they were co-productions between one of the networks and ITV. Anthony Quayle was in Strange Report, and there are other shows like that you had this British invasion, which is something we could talk about someday separately, but you had this British invasion of TV with all these imports, and it was the shows that they tended to adapt were, I think, shows that were not widely seen for one reason or another in this country. And so they took the stereotypes that they were presenting in these British shows and adapted them to American sensibilities. And so in that way, we're able to transfer the message. But the more timeless in that way, the more timeless the show was, and the more that they were based on the strength of the lead, whether it's Patrick McGowan or Roger Moore or any of these other characters where you've got Secret Agent, The Prisoner, The Saint, The Avengers. those stand on their own without having to have American versions made. And then some of them are just so quaintly British. You talked about Faulty Towers, but you could say The Vicar of Dibley, or The Thin Blue Line, what I think was something like that, with Blackadder for that matter. Those just don't translate, I think, well to American sensibilities, but put them on as British shows and understand that they're coming from a British standpoint, and people fall off their couches laughing at them.
So the final, I wanted to talk the final thing in the 70s I wanted to talk about was children's programming. And I don't want to talk about the Saturday morning shows. We can do that at another time. Although for me, one of the standouts is the Schoolhouse Rock episodes.
Yes, I had that in my notes too. That's such a part of it.
And we already did a whole show on the game shows, so we've covered that. But when I talk about children's program, I'm not really referring to Saturday morning television. I want to talk about those that are more using live character. Now we talked about Sesame Street earlier in I think in the '60s show.
Mm-hmm.
There was also the Electric Company.
Yep.
There were the Sid and Marty Krofft shows on Saturday morning, with the outlier being Land of the Lost, which was a quote-unquote serious show versus, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters.
I'm actually, one of the blogs that I follow every week is actually reviewing Land of the Lost on a week-by-week basis. So.
Yeah. There was also a show that was syndicated called the New Zoo Review, in which you had Doug and Emmy Joe, who was a total babe. And you had Freddie
to get the parents to watch too.
Freddie the Frog, Henrietta Hippo, and Charlie the Owl. They were all the same size, even though you have a hippo there. And then, to me, two of the outstanding ones, both at one point aired on PBS, was Zoom in the 1970s, early 70s, was out of Boston, and they had their own language for kids. They had episodes that were filmed, and then they would do dance. I remember The Cat Came Back the Very Next Day, which was an old blues song from like 90 years earlier, and they made it into sort of a rock opera song there. I think it was a very innovative show. Kids could write in. And then the one other show that I wanted to talk about basically with you, Zoom and the Big Blue Marble, which was was sponsored by the corporation ITT, and the world is just it had another song like the world is a big blue marble when you see it from out there, and it had little filmlets from a kid in Indonesia, a kid in Rhodesia, a kid in Peru, a kid in Norway, exchanging information with Americans. And I'm actually on a Facebook page for the Big Blue Marble. So these were two shows that were kids shows, but they treated the children intelligently. Mm-hmm. So do you have any comments on either of those two shows, Zoom or the Big Blue Marble?
Well, I think you've summarized them well. And when you look at the decade, one of the things that you see coming up repeatedly in discussions about children's programming in general is this feeling that there is a need to expose children to the wider world, to get them out of the cartoons and the chaos, the rapid pace of children's shows of the past, the sugar-fueled adrenaline rush, and give them some kind of an exposure, especially to elements, environments that they're not familiar with, and that for young black kids in Harlem, that might mean showing them what a farm is like, or what it's like being in another part of the country. For farm kids, it's taking them to the symphony or the museum, or things that they're not exposed to out on the prairies. In a more general way, for all of them, exposing them to different cultures and different countries and things like that. And that is something that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Children's Television Workshop, those were all things that they felt were very important, along with the ideas of exposing children to learning about different languages and to giving them an early start in reading, which even goes back as far as Captain Kangaroo, and to starting to become familiar with the concepts of learning that they're going to run into in school when they start there, or these are going to be things that are additions, complements to what they're learning in school. So I think they were very creative, and I'd put the Electric Company as one of those too. I think that those were shows that were very much designed to try to fill something that was not present in children's programming, and to do it in a way that they were not being talked down to. There was a series in the 60s that just kind of is a precursor to this kind of thing. There was a morning show in the 60s on NBC called Smithsonian, and it was hosted by Bill Ryan, who is a newsman at NBC. I'm a friend of his son's, and Bill Ryan did straight news things, but he also had a show like this where he was able to introduce children and young people to some of the things that the Smithsonian had to offer, and to show their relevance and to show their historical importance and different things like that. So there was, Talk to a Giant, The Friendly Giant, What's New, shows that morphed from the 60s into the 70s, where they were really dedicated to treating children like young adults, not overwhelming them with information to the point where they would go into a sensory overload, but at the same time to try to give them a glimpse into a world that they might not be familiar with right now, but that they would in all likelihood encounter as they grew older, and to give them more of a feeling and an understanding and exposure to that they wouldn't get otherwise from school. And that was really, I was reading one of my vintage TV guide magazines from the late 60s, early 70s era, where they were starting to bring satellite television, cable television into rural areas where they weren't able to get the signals so much from the big cities. And this was a theme that you would see developed in there as well. This theme that you're bringing the outside world into a place that might not get the opportunity to be able to see it on a regular basis. So I think that's what shows like this were geared toward. They were meeting that need, and as you mentioned, talking about them, how memorable some of them are. Those stay with you, whether it's the characters or the ditties or the lessons that are learned. They wanted to do it in a way that it would stick with kids and make a difference.
Well, Electric Company, speaking of, I think both Morgan Freeman and Rita Moreno are Oscar winners.
They are. Rita Moreno's an EGOT. She's won all 4 of the major ones.
Oh, yeah. So finally, let's end just in the last couple of minutes talking about Schoolhouse Rock. I just want to touch on that. These were 3-minute episodes, again on ABC.
We've got a theme that has run through much of this programming, being ABC.
Yeah, and we all, people my age, you might be a little too old for it, but I remember Verb, That's What's Happening, which was a blaxploitation film, that the superhero hitting the baseball. There was Noun is a person, place, or thing. There was the quite often now criticized America Rock about history, in terms of some of the things that were not talked about back then. But overall, I mean, it was such a spectacularly good idea to have these ditties that now 40, 50 years on, multiplication. You remember the song? Oh, yeah. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I can do the whole preamble.
In a pinch, I use that to remind myself of what the preamble is. So it stays with you. Or you remember, I'm just a bill. I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
Even the less,
they're fun.
Even the lesser ones, I remember there was a song, Interplanet Janet, she's a galaxy gal, which was about the planets and their names and whatnot to remember. So, and the thing is, Well, what you know, how would you sum it up for your typical youth now? Those
Well,
things.
I think, you know, it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain why these things stay with you. Where youth today can be so cynical about so many things that they might have a hard time understanding why these struck a chord with us. But um, one of the things that I just finished writing about in a TV guide that's going to be up on my website this Saturday. It's about TV.com. One of the things that I am looking at is this how documentaries are made. And the what links this to our subject is that successful documentarians, successful producers of TV specials like that, make it a point that you have to find the dramatic arc in a documentary. It's all about storytelling. Now, the big problem in that is to make sure you don't make the facts conform to the story you want to tell. But the point is that the difference between a dull recitation of the facts and a documentary that can capture the interest of the viewer is that you have to be able to present it as a dramatic story to capture the essential dramatic nature of life. And children's stories, in a different aspect, are the same way. When you talk about learning, you can make it about the dry numbers and the dry facts, and kids may remember it long enough to get it right on a test, and then it's going to go out of their heads. But if you can have it tell a story, as it does in these little 3-minute songs, whether you're singing about the Constitution or about verbs or about the multiplication tables, they're all mini dramas, mini stories, and you find that arc that's running through them and how you present them to children. And history doesn't have to be boring. Science, math, literature, none of this has to be boring, but it's all about using the drama or the comedy or what's inherent in it and using it to tell the story that the listeners can get involved in. That's the kind of thing that Schoolhouse Rock did so well. You can quarrel with some of the subjects, you can quarrel with some of the content, but what you can't quarrel with is the ability they had to present what they did have in a way that was going to attract children's interests.
Yeah, my hero zero.
Yeah.
um,
How wonderful you are.
yeah. Well, that should wrap it up for this show. We'll be back in a month or so with another show, maybe two. So, Mitch, thanks again. It's always good talking with you.
Thank you, Dan. It is a pleasure to be on, as always.